At the base of a low mountain pass in the North Georgia Highlands, a cluster of soapstone boulders lies half-sunk into red clay, covered in carvings that nobody alive can fully explain. Follow the old road into Union County, past Blairsville, into the Chattahoochee National Forest, and you will find the gap exactly where it has always been, cut between two ridgelines the way water finds the low ground. Bird tracks are pressed into the stone, deer tracks too, human footprints, some bare, some shaped like they are wearing something on their feet, circles nested inside circles, long wavy lines that might trace a river, or might trace something else entirely, something with no name left to call it by. Above the boulders, cut into the slope of the mountain itself, runs a set of stone terraces, walls of stacked rock climbing the hillside in rows too even to be an accident of erosion. Somebody built those walls on purpose, generations before anyone wrote this valley's name on a map. Somebody carved those tracks into stone that does not carve easily, using tools that left no metal behind. For most of the 20th century, professional archaeologists had a modest, careful answer for who and why. Then, in 2012, one writer looked at those same terraces and decided the modest answer could not possibly be enough. He was right that something here does not fully add up. He was wrong about almost everything else, and the shape of his mistake says more about how we tell stories than the rocks themselves ever could. The gap itself is quiet in a way that takes visitors by surprise. No visitor center, no gift shop, just a small pull-off along the highway and a short trail through hardwood forest that opens onto the boulders almost without warning. In early morning, before the day's hikers arrive, fog tends to sit low across the pass, and the carved stone looks less like an exhibit and more like something the mountain simply grew, which in a way it did. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Track Rock Gap sits inside land that has belonged, at different points and in overlapping ways, to more than one indigenous nation. The Cherokee knew these mountains as home for centuries before removal. So did ancestors of the Muscogee, the people archaeologists usually credit as the builders of the great mound centers that once stood across Georgia, at places like Etowah, 60-some miles to the west. Exactly which community carved which mark at Track Rock, and exactly when, is not something anyone can answer with a single clean date. That uncertainty is real. It is also, as it turned out, exactly the gap a bad theory found room to grow in. Track rock itself is a soft, greenish-gray stone called soapstone or steatite, common across the southern Appalachians and long valued by native peoples for the same reason it makes such a strange canvas here. It is soft enough to carve with stone tools, which is rare among the rock types in this part of Georgia, and durable enough, once carved, to hold a mark for well over 1,000 years. Roughly 100 individual images are cut across several large boulders scattered through the gap, more than at almost any other petroglyph site in the state. Some marks are deep and confident. Others are shallow, faint, half-worn back into the stone by centuries of rain. That difference matters. It suggests the boulders were not carved once, by one group, in one afternoon. It suggests they were returned to, again and again, by different hands, over a span of time long enough that the earliest carvings had already started to fade before the latest ones were added. The terraces are the part that first drew outside attention, and they deserve it. Climb the slope above the boulders and you find row after row of low stone walls, following the contour of the mountain the way a farmer's field follows a hillside to keep the soil from washing away in a hard rain. Georgia's state archaeologists and researchers from the University of Georgia have mapped and studied these walls for years. The leading, evidence-supported explanation is agricultural terracing, a genuine engineering solution used by indigenous farmers across parts of the Appalachians to grow crops on ground too steep to plant flat. Similar terrace systems have been documented at other sites in North Georgia, always tied to the same practical problem: how to farm a mountainside without losing it to the next storm. The terraces at Track Rock are simply among the best preserved anyone has found. Georgia does not have many petroglyph sites at all, which is part of what makes Track Rock stand out. Compared to the petroglyph-rich regions of the American Southwest, where thousands of images cover entire canyon walls, The southern Appalachians preserved relatively few carved sites, in part because much of the region's exposed rock is simply not the kind of stone that holds a mark well over time. Track rock's soapstone boulders are something of an exception inside an exception, a patch of exactly the right geology sitting in exactly the place where generations of people kept passing through a mountain gap. The site has long been recognized as significant enough to warrant formal protection, documented and monitored as part of the Chattahoochee National Forest's known archaeological resources, fenced off from casual foot traffic to slow the wear that centuries of rain had already been working on its own. What nobody can offer is a single confident date for when the first wall went up, or when the last carving was cut into the boulders below. Rock art almost never carries the kind of organic material, charcoal, bone, seed, that radiocarbon dating needs in order to work. Archaeologists are left comparing carving style to pottery styles and tool types recovered from the soil layers nearby, and using that comparison to sketch a range rather than a date. The range most researchers accept stretches from the late Archaic period, several thousand years ago, through the Mississippian period, ending sometime before the 15th century. That range is not vague because nobody tried hard enough to narrow it. It is vague because stone does not keep a calendar, and honest researchers say so instead of inventing one. The meaning of the individual carvings is harder still. A footprint is easy enough to recognize as a footprint. What it meant to the person who cut it, whether it marked a boundary, recorded a journey, honored an ancestor, or served a purpose with no real equivalent in how we think today, is not written down anywhere, because the people who made these marks did not leave a glossary behind for anyone else to use. Some researchers have pointed out similarities between a handful of track rock symbols and imagery found on shell gorgets, pottery, and copper plates from the wider Mississippian world, the same interconnected culture that produced the mounds at Etowah and, far to the west, Cahokia. Other researchers are more cautious, noting that circles and animal tracks are close to universal motifs that can appear independently in unrelated traditions with no direct link between them at all. Both positions get argued in good faith. Neither one closes the question. That honest uncertainty is where the trouble started. A gap in the record can hold real research, patient and slow, built one careful comparison at a time. It can also hold whatever story someone wants badly enough to tell. In the spring of 2012, a writer named Richard Thornton published a series of articles arguing that track rock was not the work of local indigenous farmers and carvers at all, but the remains of a lost city built by refugees from a collapsed Maya civilization in Mexico, who had supposedly sailed north, settled in the Georgia mountains, and left the terraces and petroglyphs behind as proof of who they had been. The claim spread fast. A national science magazine ran a headline suggesting archaeologists had uncovered a Maya city hidden in Georgia. Within days, the story had traveled far past anywhere Thornton's original post could have reached on its own, repeated by outlets that had done no independent checking of the claim underneath it. The professional response was fast too, and it was blunt. Georgia's state archaeologist at the time, Mark Williams, along with U.S. Forest Service archaeologists who had actually excavated and mapped the terraces themselves, said plainly that there was no artifact, no pottery style, no construction technique, no genetic or linguistic thread of any kind connecting track rock to Mesoamerica. The terracing matched known indigenous agricultural methods already documented across the southern Appalachians. The stonework matched local building traditions, not Maya architecture, which relies on cut and dressed stone on a completely different scale and a completely different plan. Cherokee and Muscogee representatives objected too, and for a reason that had nothing to do with academic territory. The Maya theory did not just get the facts wrong, it quietly assumed the actual ancestors of the actual living nations tied to this land could not have built something this sophisticated on their own, and needed a more famous, faraway civilization to have done it for them instead. That assumption is not a small mistake tucked inside an otherwise interesting theory. It is one of the oldest, laziest moves in pseudo-archaeology, the same instinct that once credited the mound cities of the Mississippi Valley to a lost race of white giants rather than the indigenous nations who actually raised them. Track rock got the 21st century version of that same move, dressed up in Maya calendars and satellite photographs instead of giants. The terraces were real. The petroglyphs were real. The unanswered questions about both were real. None of it required inventing a lost expedition from Central America to explain. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What the terraces and the carvings almost certainly represent, once the Maya theory is set aside, is a genuine and sophisticated indigenous landscape, shaped over a long span of time by more than one generation and very likely by more than one community. The broader Mississippian world that produced the mounds at Etowah, 60-some miles west of Track Rock, also produced the kind of engineered agricultural terracing found on this mountainside, along with a shared vocabulary of symbols, spirals, circles, animal tracks, that turns up across a huge stretch of the southeastern United States. The people who built and maintained Etowah's mounds, and very plausibly the terraces at Track Rock as well, are understood by most archaeologists today as ancestral to the Muscogee, forced out of Georgia during the same removal era that later swept the Cherokee out of these same mountains. Cherokee communities, whose own presence in this region runs back centuries before removal as well, hold their own relationship to Track Rock Gap, describing it in oral tradition as a significant place long before any outside writer ever set foot near the Boulders. Archaeologists who study the wider Mississippian world call its shared set of symbols, spirals, raptors, serpents, hands marked with an eye in the palm, the southeastern ceremonial complex, a network of imagery and belief that connected mound centers stretching from Oklahoma to Georgia to Florida across several centuries. Whether Track Rock's carvings sit fully inside that tradition, sit at its outer edge, or represent an older, separate layer of symbolism that simply overlapped with it in places, is itself a live question researchers continue to work through. What is not in question, once the Maya theory is off the table, is that the imagery has clear, documented roots inside the indigenous Southeast, not somewhere outside it. It is worth sitting with how ordinary the real explanation actually is, and how much more interesting that ordinariness turns out to be than the version that made headlines. A collapsed Maya empire sending refugees 1,000 miles north to build a secret mountain city sounds, on the surface, like the bigger story. In practice, it explains nothing that the modest version does not already explain better. A community of farmers looking at a steep, forested mountainside and deciding to solve the problem of growing food on it, using stone, patience, and knowledge passed down across generations, is not a smaller story than a lost empire. It is simply a truer one, and it happens to be the one the evidence at Track Rock actually supports, terrace by terrace, carving by carving. In the years since the Maya controversy, the site has drawn a different kind of attention, quieter and more careful. Archaeologists working with the U.S. Forest Service have continued documenting individual carvings, some worn so faint that a slight change in the afternoon light is the only way to see them at all. Consultation with tribal historic preservation offices, including the Muscogee Creek Nations, has become a standard part of how work at the site is now approached. A recognition that the descendants of the people who most likely made these marks have a say in how and whether the site is studied and interpreted going forward. That was not how Track Rock was treated in 2012, when an outside theory got to speak for the mountain before anyone with an actual ancestral connection to it was asked a single question. That kind of consultation is not symbolic. Decisions about how new carvings get documented, how the site is interpreted for the hikers who wander through it, and how any future excavation would even be approached now, typically involve tribal historic preservation staff working alongside Forest Service archaeologists, a relationship built specifically because past researchers, and certainly past amateur theorists, made decisions about this land without asking the nations connected to it. It is a slower way of working than publishing a viral blog post. Most archaeologists in the field would now argue it is the only version of the work that has any real claim to being done right. None of that careful, respectful work has closed every question, and it was never going to. Archaeologists still cannot say with certainty which specific community carved which specific image, or in what order the roughly 100 marks at Track Rock were added across what may have been 1,000 years or more of intermittent use. They cannot say for certain whether every terrace on the slope was built for farming, or whether some of them served a different, more ceremonial purpose that simply happens to resemble agriculture from the outside. They cannot fully explain why this particular gap, out of the countless mountain passes across North Georgia, became the place worth returning to, generation after generation, to leave a mark in stone that would still be legible 1,000 years later. Those are not gaps the wrong story ever actually filled. They are the real mystery, still sitting exactly where it has always been, waiting on an answer that popular headlines cannot supply, and that some questions may simply never receive. There is also the matter of the boulders that have never been fully surveyed at all. Track Rock Gap is not a single fenced clearing with every stone accounted for. The wider slope carries loose rock, thick undergrowth, and terrain rough enough that a complete inventory of every carved surface has never quite been finished, which means researchers cannot say with full confidence that the roughly 100 documented images represent everything there is to find. Every so often, a mark turns up that nobody had cataloged before, sometimes because a fallen tree exposed a boulder face that had been hidden under decades of leaf litter, sometimes because someone simply looked at a familiar rock from a different angle, at a different hour, and noticed a line that had been there the whole time. Strip away the lost expedition, the collapsed empire, the refugees who supposedly sailed a continent to leave their mark on a Georgia mountainside, and what is left standing at Track Rock Gap is arguably more remarkable, not less. A community of indigenous farmers and carvers engineered a working terrace system on a slope steep enough to defeat most modern gardeners, using nothing but stone, labor, and generations of accumulated knowledge about how water moves across a hillside. Their descendants, or their neighbors, or both, returned to the same boulders across centuries to add tracks and circles and lines whose exact meaning was never meant to survive for strangers to casually decode. That is not a mystery that needed an outside civilization to make it impressive. It was never missing an explanation. It was only ever missing the patience to sit with an honest one. Stand in the gap today and the questions are still doing most of the talking. A ranger can point out where the terraces run, and roughly how old the oldest carvings are believed to be, within a range wide enough to span the rise and fall of entire civilizations elsewhere in the world. Nobody can hand you a translation of what a particular spiral meant to the hands that cut it, or say with full certainty whose hands they were. The soapstone holds its silence the same way it has held it since long before Georgia had a name on any map, and it will likely go on holding it after every current theory, careful or reckless, has been argued through and set aside. Researchers will keep coming back with better dating methods than the last generation had, better ways of reading a worn line in low light, and better relationships with the nations whose ancestors most likely left these marks in the first place. What they find next may narrow the range, or it may only complicate it further, the way real evidence usually does. Some marks in stone were never meant to be fully solved. They were meant to be found, again, by whoever bothered to climb the gap and look closely enough to notice they were there at all, waiting under the pines the whole time. The fence around the boulders is low, easy to see over, not meant to keep anyone out so much as to remind visitors what they are standing in front of. Beyond it, the terraces climb the ridge until the tree line swallows them, row after row disappearing into laurel and pine, still holding the shape someone gave this mountainside long before anyone thought to ask permission to study it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.